Had to start preparing for my first major field trip, of course, involving everything that you have in anthropological research, learning Swahili, of course, an important and strange experience because it's a language with a structure, a grammatical structure that you've never seen before, and beautiful language. I felt at a certain point that I could speak it fairly well, but my reading and writing of Swahili has never come to an academic level, so I felt I couldn't really participate sufficiently sometimes in Tanzanian university life the way I would have liked. But anyway. That was one factor. Of course, that had to take place well before we went there. Before I went there, because initially only the first trip I first did with my partner, and she came to visit a few years later. But it was. Well, you know, all the hardships that you associate with field research were more or less represented, right? I was very lonely for a time. Luckily, I did have a contact via a friend in the Netherlands, in Dar es Salaam, who also became a wonderful friend, an architect called John Mlundwa, whose house became a sort of pied-à-terre whenever we were there. But I wanted to go to the main mission area, or the main mission post actually, in the Uluguru Mountains. Not so much to settle on the post, but in the village next to it. And first of all, they turned out to be very difficult. The authorities turned out to be quite difficult. And although I'm not completely sure why the story, as I could put it together afterwards, was that from the mountains you had a free view of a camp of the ANC, of the South African opposition party, banned at the time because apartheid was still in force. And not very long before I applied for a permit to do research there, it seems that an American anthropologist had hung around in the wrong place in those mountains, whether by intent or not, it was completely unclear. But it seems that she was deported. She was literally sent out of the country, and the regional district commissioner basically said, we won't allow any anthropologists there. And people said, oh, come on, go there yourself, talk to him. You know, if he hears you, he might make a difference. And in fact, I did that. And to my surprise and delight, he said, oh, you're on the other side of the mountains. Right? So I got his signature. Went back to Dar es Salaam. This all took months, right? Back to Dar es Salaam to get the official research permit. And said, oh, but you can't be in the country when you don't have a research permit. You have to go out of the country. I had to go to Nairobi, to Kenya, just to wait until they had processed the thing, and then I could come back and pick it up. And in the meantime, also, you know, being lonely in Dar es Salaam, I did a lot of archival work because that was actually the only thing I could do, which turned out in the end to be really good, also given my eventual interest. in the longer term history of that place. But my father got ill, and really seriously ill. He almost died. So John said, Peter, you can't just hang around here. Go home, right? See your father. Come back. Which again was what I did. Sort of prematurely cutting short the field stage. Even before I had really settled in, although I had made good steps, I met someone, I can't remember exactly through whom, who also became, Adriani Nyawale became a very good friend. Again, a former priest with a lot of European training, had spent a lot of time in Germany and France. And he was now married to a refugee from Burundi and living in Morogoro. But his parents, he came from that village, and his parents had a house there and they had a lot of room. So he basically offered me the place. He said, and they will be happy to have you. And so I was in fact already set up when all the things with my father happened. So, well, returned back to Tanzania, into the field work with an assistant who, after a few months, turned out to have tricked me in a lot of ways, who was also not exactly popular in the village because he had a history in the army. He had fought in the war against Idi Amin, right, when Tanzania basically drove out Idi Amin from Uganda. And he had of course, soldiers have a reputation of being violent and independable, and he had a little wild streak, a little bit, although he was a really nice guy most of the time. And we had a lot of fun, but he turned out to be a little bit free with some of the monies that I meant for other things. So all these things happened. I had to get another assistant, and I guess one of the most significant moments in that whole process, also scary but also very, in the end, educational, was that one of the missionaries, one of the Dutch missionaries in the place, who lived in Morogoro, but he had spent a lot of time in the mountains, mountain stations himself, had warned me of the fact that white visitors to the mountains sometimes got accused of being instrumental in killing Africans and draining their blood for a strong kind of medicine. The name for that was the Mumiani, and it was a well-known rumor there, and there were very scary stories of a South African prospector having been chased all the way down the river from down to the plains and things like that. And of course my partner, when she arrived, also knew about these things, and there was a very tense moment when we were walking along with my new assistant along the mission past the carpentry factory. And people somehow seemed to refuse to give way when we wanted to cross a bridge. And we knew that there were rumors about, and that they were tied to my former assistant. Because, as a military man, he might be my violent, accomplice. Of course, I was living with an African family who had become very good and tight friends by that time, and especially Mama, the mother of the house, was a fiercely aggressive defender of her household and the larger family. So I personally had this feeling, it's going to be all right. But the missionary, Father Winkelmolen, was also, became an important friend, although he was a very, he also had a bad reputation. He had been accused of being the Mumiani several times. He said, the best thing you can do is don't talk about it, just act as if you don't really know that something's going on. behave normally, continue to speak to everybody, and you know, it will pass. And it did. But that ended up in an article published in the Dutch journal Etnofor, where I realized that I was just part of a long history of accusations, usually associated, it seemed, with you know, people who suddenly appeared in a mountain area or another relatively remote spot where especially white people were scarce, while the inhabitants didn't know what they were doing there. So they picked up rumors to explain to themselves what these people were doing. And the rumor itself and the name itself, Mumiani, turned out to be traceable to a moment in 1904 when regiments of the King's African Rifles, so the African part of the British Army, were camping together near Mombasa in Kenya with sepoys from India. And in India, there was already a rumor about that white colonials were draining bodily fluids from Indians, usually on the second floor of hospitals. That's what the second floors were for, according to this rumor. Turning it into mumia. Mumia was literally derived from the word for mummy, and probably also referred to the supposedly restorative or medicinal qualities of the tar that was used on mummies. It's a Persian word originally, and my thought, but this was, you couldn't even call it oral history, it's more historical speculation, I guess, but that these rumors were shared between the sepoys and the King's African Rifles, because it's exactly in 1904 that the rumors first appear in Kenya and then start to travel downwards, south, southwest, southeast. And that Mumiani might be a Swahilified version of it, because the ni suffix is a place name, so it might mean the place where Mumiani is made or something like that. But of course, it became a person. So anyway, that's one of those stories. In the end, I guess the whole project was the project was, again, like my Irish fieldwork, was based on a big failure, because, again, in retrospect, it is stupid that you didn't think of it before, but there were two major key informants, sets of key informants, apart from the ordinary Catholics among whom I was living, right? I was living in the house of a Catholic family and joining them for in church and things like that. You had the Dutch missionaries. About 10 of them were still left in the region, but of course I could collect stories from before. And many, that was one group. The other group was the African priests who had succeeded them in most of the mission station, now having become independent Catholic, having become an independent Catholic diocese. The African priests accused the missionaries of being racist, and unfortunately, they were probably many times right. The missionaries accused the African priests of not holding to a vow of poverty, misusing the money of the diocese, and not being exactly serious about the vow of celibacy. And they were also probably right. So neither of these groups wanted to talk to me, right, openly. With a few exceptions who actually asked me, I'm not sure that I would appreciate it if you put this on paper and publish it, right? So that was quite a dilemma. Here, the fact that I spent so much time in the archives became an asset, right? Which was actually just because I hadn't anything else to do. And I wanted to know about, of course, the colonial history of the mission. So I read all these colonial documents. And then I began to realize, yes, but I know quite a lot from those documents already about how the mission operated. And there are some moments that require explanation. Relationship with the schools, for example, because in fact the British didn't do much about education. They were extremely slack in that respect, like many colonial authorities were, but the British were pretty consistent in it. So the missionaries took on the task of providing most of the primary and secondary education. Then there was a very interesting moment, and all of a sudden, and I didn't come to realize until very late, because I also started to search in the archives of the mission itself, and reading through with the help of this father, who was enthusiastic about the fact that I would also restore and have an eye for all these mission diaries. To learn about the history of the different mission stations. And slowly I came to realize that there was a big moment somewhere in the early 1930s when mass conversions started to take place. In fact, before that time, nothing much happened. Most of the people who became, who were converted to Catholicism were in fact, you could say, marginal people in the society. But from about 1930, 1931, 1933, 32 to 3, suddenly whole communities wanted to join. And I had the feeling it had to do something with that colonial presence, with the British colonial presence. So the question became, what changed? What happened? That became a very important sort of research goal, and I wanted to get an answer to that question. Of course, what was already from the very start for me an important focus was that I was never just studying Africa as such. I was just as interested in the missionaries, and I had chosen a Dutch missionary, a Catholic congregation, precisely because I could control that cultural world a little bit. I mean, we had quick access to it through Dutch. My own family was Catholic, so I had a sort of emotional connection there. I could sense the affects that were important. Although my parents were never much, concerned about mission, and I had one uncle who was a priest, but he also was not a missionary. I think he brought on one missionary artifact, which was a reindeer horns from the Sami country, somewhere up north in Norway, turned into a candelabra. That was the only thing he ever had from a mission. Anyway, what I was doing was not a study of African Catholics in the place where they lived, but a study of how life in an African mountain area was affected through global influences. That was the core field focus, and I didn't call it multi-sited ethnography at the time, but in the end it turned out to be just that, because I spent a lot of time also with the missionaries in their main house in Gemert in the Netherlands, where I basically participated in a lot of parts of daily life, to have the opportunity to talk to them, do interviews, go through the archives, get to know stuff that I'm still working on today, because they were also the ones who set up what is now the Afrika Museum in Bergendal near Nijmegen. And even that was even done by a father who was the sole occupant for a long time of a major mission station not so far from where I did my field work. So it was high up in the mountain. There's another story connected to it, but I want to finish this idea first. So what I brought this together, but usually studies of missions, whether by historians or religious studies people or anthropologists, were usually about doctrine, and whether or not converts followed that doctrine. It was very much tied to the religious message. And I felt there was, in those studies, the more I spent time in the field and combining the archives with, being together with Catholics in that place, I felt that there was a big dimension of the life among African Catholics missing. And that became, I guess, the core theme of my thesis, which is later called A Politics of Presence, but was very much based on a concept that was brought in by Michel Foucault in thinking about how people were disciplined by the authorities and the ways of thinking, the discourses that they were living with, the microphysics of power. And that had to do not just with doctrine, but also very much with, built environment, exchanges, material exchanges between people. What does one group give, and what does it think it gets in return? Why? What are the values associated with those exchanges? And that became the core meaning of the term in that title, right? The main title became A Politics of Presence, but actually the core term is contact between missionaries and Africans in late colonial Tanganyika, because to me the term contact meant literal material being in touch with each other, coming close to each other, being in the same place, material exchanges, stuff like that. So I thought it was quite important, therefore, also to know the material being, so to speak, of the missionaries in their Dutch houses. What did they learn there? What were they used to? What did they eat? One answer to that question is that they were still eating Dutch food, even when they spent 25 years in Bagamoyo. These poor African cooks had to cook peas and potatoes, and they never got to appreciate the joys of rice and an African chicken, so to speak. Anyway. So that became the major theme of the thesis, but let me just see where I wanted to take this. It also meant that I did research work on the missionaries in their home area themselves, and one result of that, for example, is also an interest that I still have in material culture and exhibition, and there was a photo essay published in Critique of Anthropology. By that time that was published, I was part of the editorial board of Critique of Anthropology, which was a direct result of the conference organization that I mentioned earlier, and that came about because with Bob Scholte dead, the Dutch part of the editing of Critique of Anthropology lost its main editor. So Johannes Fabian, Peter Geschire, and me and someone else, but I'm afraid I forget at this point who exactly that was. Jojada Verrips, of course. The four of us took over, with me actually acting a little bit as a kind of managing editor. The young guy who does the work, while the older guys sort of say what to do. Right, and I had to travel to and fro to London a lot of times to talk to the British editors there, and very educational experience. Also very useful in a later career. But the photo essay was important to me because it somehow made me realize that there was part of the life world of these missionaries that didn't have exactly much to do with the religious message. In the Mission Propaganda Journal, you had quite a few photographs of missions, but many more of life in the mission houses, but in the Netherlands, right? So where they educated new missionaries and all that. But there were also a substantial number of what you could call exotic photographs. Many of them also very beautiful, taken by very accomplished photographers, sometimes members of the congregation. Of West African headdresses and indigenous dress and all those kind of things, but very exoticized and almost never with a caption other than an ethnographic one, right? So it was never tied to the conversion story, to the idea of what they were doing there in the first place, why they were going there in the first place. So that work in the, you could say, the mission home itself taught me also a lot about what was going on in the mission area, because I started to realize, all these people, they don't live a religious life all the time. A lot of their life is secular, and that material part of interaction was to many of their converts equally important. And that's what really ended up in the thesis. And one of the chapters that I was most excited about writing really also spoke to that. It's a chapter about white magic, because one of the striking things, and also one of the conundra that the missionaries never were able to solve, was that people constantly returned back to indigenous religious authorities, despite the fact that they were Catholics, right? And so they were punished for it. But that was logical, because the people regarded the missionaries as essentially white magicians who weren't capable of doing real evil. But that didn't mean that real evil wasn't still present in the society. So witches were still about, and you needed other people who were equally evil as these witches to punish the witches or kill them, or right. So that deadlock was an important part of this balance between the secular and the religious that ended up in specific material exchanges. And that's really what I think I still continue to work on those themes, although not all of them in Africa.